Good morning. Thrips are one of those now you see them, now you don't things, because we tend to have some years where it's not really an issue and it gets sort of shifted to everybody's back burner in the mind, and then we get a season like we've just had where suddenly there's damage again and everybody is jumping up and down and thrips is on everybody's lips again. So if we're going to talk about thrips management, I think we need to start just looking at who's who when we talk about thrips. At the moment, it is the western flower thrips, which is an exotic thrips and only came to us in the late 80s. That's become the dominant pest thrips on our deciduous fruit. But we do still at times find fairly high numbers of the Thrips tabaki or onion thrips, which is on the right-hand side there. And also of Franklinella schultzi, that's the cromneck thrips or blossom thrips. And it actually used to be probably the more dominant thrips before western flower thrips arrived. I've put Heliothrips sylvanus in there. We tried to trace actually why it was called the guava thrips, and those records seem to be lost somewhere there in the non-existent archives in Nelspruit. But for some reason it's got the guava thrips as its other name. It is not often a pest on most of our deciduous fruits. We do sometimes find that with persimmons we get heavy damage late season, but it is one of those thrips that come in. They're mostly leaf feeders, mostly the older mature leaves, and we often have growers getting very panicky later in the season when they see these large numbers of quite prominent black thrips with a little white stripe down the back running around, and then they want to get ready to do something about it, but mostly it's one of those we don't actually have to worry about so much. Identifying thrips is very tricky. I think people have a misconception. Pia alluded to the variation that we find in false codling moth. And it is the same with thrips and actually with all other insects. A population of any particular insect species is just like a population of the humans sitting in this room. We all share certain key similarities, but we all look quite different if you know how to look. And it's the same thing with thrips. And for that reason, we find that, yes, there are often certain color patterns and certain size differences that can be a key, but they are not always the primary distinctive features. And that's what makes it so difficult. If you've got a young western flower thrips or even the young cromneck thrips, that little schultzi that looks black and brown, when they just hatched from the little pupae, they all the same sort of strawy, yellowy color that Thrips tabaki is. So if you just happen to catch that one that's very young, you can mistake it for something else if you're just going by color. So it's important that if you have thrips identified or you think you've got a problem, just get someone to verify your identification. If we want to manage thrips properly, not only do we need to know who we're dealing with, we need to know when the critical periods are, when is the damage done. And if we're talking about the classical egg-laying or oviposition damage, which is the pansy spot that you can see there in the bottom on the left, and also some of those little oviposition sites that develop not into a pansy spot, but that develop into those little lesions, those little, it looks like little moon craters on your fruit. That is done very early on, and we have found that the western flower thrips females will actually enter the blossoms before they even open. The moment in your, just around balloon stage where the first leaves, it just has to separate sufficiently for that tiny little flattened thrips to climb in between the petals, and they go into your closed little blossom. They lay the eggs on the style, on the little anthers, on the little ovary, and then also they really like the calyx and the little flower stem. So the problem is, come blossom time, some of the damage has already been done. In terms of feeding damage, you can imagine if they've been laying eggs on your young flowers, as those larvae hatch, they will now migrate into the little remains of the flower, and they go onto that little ovary and the developing fruitlet, and as they feed, they cause damage. Thrips have sucking mouth parts, and they actually feed by inserting their little hypodermic stylets into individual cells, and they suck out the contents cell by cell. Now, those damaged cells in a rapidly developing fruitlet, of course, that causes damage. They become corky, and you get those typical scarred lesions or the russeting that develops. Later in the season, if they feed on the ripening fruit, mostly stone fruit, but we do occasionally get some russeting damage on, some silvering damage on apples, although it's rare. Then you get the silvering damage simply because, again, the cells under the epidermis have now been emptied out, and as light reflects on this little empty cell, it gives you that silvery appearance. So there are two periods in our fruit development, right at blossom time and just before ripening, when the fruit is actually prone to thrips damage. It's also important to remember, if we want to manage thrips, what conditions actually are favorable for them. Warm, dry winter, or relatively warmer, drier winters. Remember, a lot of the thrips, the pupal stages will be in the soil and in the leaf litter. So if it is not very wet for prolonged periods that fungi and nematodes and things can get at them, then the survival rate obviously will be higher. If we've got a spring period where it warms up quite quickly and it is relatively dry, it favors a rapid build-up of the population. And then in spring, Western flower thrips in particular, it is a flower specialist. So anything that flowers there will attract it. So if you've got cover crops or weeds in your orchard that begin to flower, if your orchard starts flowering, it is very attractive to them. And particularly in the northern provinces where we have very early flowering with the stone fruit, and the felt surrounding it is still coming out of their dry winter. It's like lighting up a lighthouse and say, "You come all ye who are hungry." They also sometimes, after flowering, infest the growth tips. And again, particularly in our northern provinces, that is what we find with table grapes and with the stone fruit, that they then also cause shoot damage when there's no more flowers for them. It is precisely their wide host range that makes them so difficult to control. If you thought fruit fly has a wide host range, well, here's another member of that club. Previous work we did in the Hex River Valley, we sampled quite a number of indigenous plants in the veld on the mountainside around the vineyard, and we found them in there as well. They've got very cryptic habits. They're not thrips that like to be in the open, so they will always prefer more complex flowers. There where the petals join, where there's a little crevice to crawl into, that is where they go. That's also why they like going into the blossoms before they open properly. And of course, that very habit makes it very hard to reach them with any contact product. They build up resistance very rapidly, and in fact, a lot of when the thrips arrived in South Africa, Western flower thrips, it was already resistant to a whole lot of products used overseas. So we are constantly looking to manage the resistance. It makes resistance management in your control measures also of paramount importance. And then chemical control during flowering is always an issue, because you've got pollinators on the one side and you've got a pest insect on the other side. Later season damage also has its own problems because you now run into issues with residues on the fruit. And then the local climatic conditions, of course, are very good for thrips. We've got a relatively mild climate. So trying to monitor it is very important because that is the first step towards managing it. If you're hanging your blue sticky traps, they are the ones that are best suited for western flower thrips, if that is your problem. But please remember you hang them outside of the canopy, not as in this instance where it's hanging in the shade. It needs the full sun so that you get the right degree of light reflectance off the blue surface so that it's very attractive to the thrips. And you start monitoring very early. Just when you start getting to balloon stage, even just before, we put our traps up as soon as the blossom starts showing the little white tips, rather earlier than later. Whatever you do, it is still important to make sure that somebody verifies the identity of the thrips that you're dealing with. So to successfully manage thrips, history of the orchard is important. Are you in an area that is historically prone to thrips damage? Was the climate in the preceding winter and the spring, is it favorable for thrips? If you get these nice bergwind conditions in spring, well, you should be on the lookout. You must start monitoring early and make sure that the ID is confirmed and apply your control measures timelessly. It doesn't help to let them lay the eggs already because then it is too late. These products don't really kill the eggs. They might have an effect on the larvae, but then the oviposition damage has been done. Those thrips at the bottom there, all those ones with the little GT stripes across them and the very dark black one with a little tube at the, looks like a little tube extending from its abdomen, these are predatory thrips species. They will eat fungal spores and other thrips, larvae, and other small little mites and insects. So if that is what you're catching, you shouldn't be spraying anything. And that is why I stress the whole issue of having the thrips identified. Because sometimes growers actually have the good guys there and they get very upset that they've got a problem and they don't have a problem. There is no threshold level for thrips on the traps. Whether you are using the knockdown method with blossoms and growth tips or whether you're using sticky traps, when you find the first thrips there, then you should start applying your control. Otherwise, it can run away with you, and then you run into problems because you've now already brought in pollinators and all of that, and now you have to wait until the bees go, and if you wait until the bees go, you've koel is deur die kerk. And it's very important, again, we are lucky at the moment, well, relatively lucky. We have a range of products that are currently registered on stone fruit and on pome fruit. We have some natural light options. We have some conventional chemical options. But if we misuse any of them, we're going to run into serious problems. Because Lindy will tell you how strict markets are and what products they're allowed, and some guys are in markets where they anyway only have one or two options. Please make sure that we do not lose those products by overusing a single product. If your cover crop or the weeds around or in your orchard happen to be flowering at the time when your orchard starts flowering, that is not the time to do weed control or to mow those flowers. If you were a little bit late in your control and you slipped up, you're just going to have to bite the bullet until after flowering, because if you cut those cover crops and things, if you take those flowers away, where are the thrips going to go? Straight up into your trees and into your blossoms. So cover crop management and managing that is an important factor. We have been doing some work looking at the possibility of trap crops and using that to lure the thrips away, but we are not quite at a stage where we can make recommendations for a field application, but that is where we are hopefully heading in future. For the moment, just do not disturb if they are already flowering. And as always, if you're choosing products, that is not something we can give you a recipe for. You need to liaise with your marketers, with your own representatives, your advisors, to choose the products that's best for you, but also that's acceptable for your market. Otherwise, we're going to run into big problems. Thanks.